Today we're really delighted to welcome Noam Sienna, Dr. Noam Sienna, newly minted PhD, and he's going to be talking to us on the theme of rabbis with inky fingers, looking at the 18th century Hebrew book, and of course printing was a significant business within both the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi diasporas, and indeed in Amsterdam there was a bit of an overlap. And Noam also is rapidly establishing himself as an expert on our subject. So it's a very big pleasure to welcome him today. And he will speak for about 45 minutes, an hour, however it goes. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat, and we can ask him later, or if need be, we can ask him in progress. So thank you everyone for being here. Just to remind everybody to thank those who are our sponsors on Patreon. Without you, we couldn't do this. If anybody else wishes to join our patrons, it would be a great pleasure and honor. And Noam, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, or good morning, I suppose, depending on where you are. I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity to share some of my work with you, and so grateful to David and to Ton for organizing it and making it happen. And as David said, you can support the work they're doing. They're really bringing so much interesting and important work on the Sephardi diaspora and the history and genealogy of Sephardi communities. So definitely glad to be a part of this work. So this talk comes out of my dissertation research on Jewish book culture in the early modern Sephardi world. And as David mentioned, I just completed my PhD at the University of Minnesota in May. So the larger project is trying to study Jewish books as both material objects and also social objects. So how they are physically produced and circulated, and what role they play in the communities that they move through throughout those processes of production and circulation. So most of the dissertation is focused geographically on North Africa. But as I was researching, I understood more and more that books and book production were a site of connection between Jewish communities and a facilitator of movement across communities. So that's what we're going to see today. North African Jews, in particular, traveled extensively in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries in order to bring manuscripts to print at Hebrew presses in Europe or the Ottoman Empire. So what I want to do today, or tonight, I suppose, is give you a brief background about Hebrew printing. And then we're going to follow one particular book that moved from Algeria to Amsterdam in the early 18th century. And we're going to follow the people involved with it along the way and how it made its way into its finished form. And I hope to highlight how this study in particular, but also this methodology in general, offers both historical and genealogical interest. So, as some of you may know, Hebrew printing with movable type emerged in the 15th century, just a few decades after the fateful labors of Johannes Gutenberg in Mainz. And by the early 18th century, there were hundreds of Hebrew presses established across Europe and in the Ottoman Empire. But while their products, meaning the Jewish books that they printed, have long been the object of academic study and the focus for innumerable collectors of rare books, there is still much that we don't know about the actual process of creating a Hebrew book in the early modern period. So that's what we're going to explore today. And I'll say that for comparative purposes, scholars of early modern European printing in general, Christian, Latin printing and vernacular printing, have a much larger body of sources to draw on. They've used marked up manuscripts, printing manuals, archival records of printing houses to really flesh out the messy and collaborative work of bringing a book to press, including the encounters between different kinds of people, authors, correctors, compositors, pressmen, and other people who are what are called print professionals, people who work in the bookmaking industry. But for early modern Hebrew printing, we don't have really that kind of data. We're mostly restricted to analyses of the finished product, looking at the paratexts, the title pages, the introductions, the colophons, to try and gain insight into the working process of authors and printers. And there is a lot that can be learned from that, and we're going to see some examples of that. So this study, meaning my research, combines that kind of data, those data, with a new piece of evidence, which I discovered, which is an actual manuscript that was marked up for use in a printing house to document how a printed book was actually made. So we're going to have this case study of a single book that's going to frame our talk. It is not only one that we happen to have uniquely detailed and extensive documentation of, it happens to be one of the central case studies of my dissertation. So you can imagine I'm afraid I have quite a bit to say about it, but I will attempt to be concise. And I also would like to acknowledge that this talk is adapted from a forthcoming article of mine, which studies this book in full, which will appear, God willing, in the next issue of the journal Studia Rosenthaliana, which is really the foremost journal for the history of Jews in the Low Countries. So if you are interested in the full version with footnotes, it will appear there, hopefully in the coming months. So stay tuned. So let's start from the end, as it were. The book that we're speaking about. Here's the finished product. It's called Sefer HaTashbetz, as you see. It was printed in Amsterdam in 1739 at the press of an Ashkenazi Jew named Naphtali Hertz Levi Rofer, also known by his Dutch name, Hartog Alexander Levi von Emden. But how did this book get to Amsterdam? That's the story that we're going to try and unravel. So just to introduce you to the text itself, Sefer HaTashbetz is a collection of responsa, or Jewish legal literature on questions and answers, that was written originally by a late medieval Sephardi rabbi named Shimon Bar Tzemach Duran. You see his name in big letters on the title page. He's also called by his acronym, the Rashbatz. So the Rashbatz was born in Spain, but settled in Algiers in 1391 and died there in 1444. And his family stayed in Algeria, and his responsa and his other books were copied in manuscript within the family for the next 3 centuries. The Jewish communities of North Africa, which I also sometimes will call the Maghreb, after what it's called in Arabic, had a vibrant book culture, but there were no Hebrew presses anywhere in North Africa until the mid-19th century, barring, I'll just put a footnote, barring 2 very brief attempts in the 16th and 18th centuries. You can read my dissertation if you want that. Just to be clear, technically there were 2 very brief attempts, but forget about those. Really, by and large, there were no printing presses in North Africa until the end of the 19th century. So like other areas of the Jewish world where they didn't have a local printing industry, if you had a book that you wanted to distribute or share with people, you had 2 choices. You could copy it by hand in a manuscript, which was cheaper and faster and easier, but took your own effort to copy it and reached a very limited number of people because you could only make 1 or 2 or 3 copies. Or you could travel abroad to find a printing press, which could be a very lengthy and very expensive project, as we'll see in a moment. But if successful, it was guaranteed to reach a much larger audience and make a much larger impact. So for whatever combination of reasons, we don't know, but this particular book, Sefer HaTashbetz, was not printed. It was copied in manuscript until the early 1700s. And at that point, an Algerian Jew named Meir Crescas, and you see his name also in big letters, took the initiative to print Sefer HaTeshbeitz. Here's a portrait. We'll come back to this portrait at the end. It's a very interesting portrait. But we know almost nothing about Crescas himself. He was not a descendant of the rabbi, the author of the Rashbats. He writes a very long and chatty introduction, which we will delve into. From it, we learn that he was 45 years old at the time of printing, which puts his birth sometime around 1695. And he says that he decided to print Sefer HaTeshbeitz sometime in the 1730s after obtaining a copy of the manuscript from the library of the Duran family. He then got a letter from the rabbinic court of Algiers testifying to the importance of the book. And he began traveling around asking for subscriptions, which are essentially pre-orders for the book. And the money was needed because if you're printing a book, you have to pay the printer. This is the nature of printing expenses. You have to buy all of the paper and the ink, and you have to pay the workers to print the books before you can sell any of the books. So you need a lot of capital up front. And this is one of the major economic features of printing in the early modern period, one of the great economic barriers of printing. So when you study printing, one of the major things you encounter is people trying to get money, raise money to start the printing process, because you need to pay the printer up front. And that's where the subscriptions come in. And he describes his travels at length in his introduction, and he lists all of his donors and hosts by name in the various places that he traveled. And so because of this, we can actually track Crescas as he traveled across Europe. So I've summarized it in this chart. You can see he starts in Algiers in the 1730s, but it might be easier to visualize on a map. So I translated those data into this little animation, which I will actually play. I did with the help of the University of Minnesota digital cartography program. So this shows the travels of Meir Crescas. In green, an initial journey that he takes to the Ottoman Empire and then back to Algiers. Then in blue, his travels across North Africa to Italy and then through France to the Sephardic communities in Western France, and then by boat to Amsterdam. And then in purple, a final round of fundraising trips that he took from Amsterdam to other cities in the Low Countries, to England, to Germany, and then back to Amsterdam. So that's mapping his whole journey. In some places, it seems that he just sold a few book orders here and there, but in other places, he received some pretty major gifts. So as an example, as you see here in The Hague, he received a donation from the Sephardi noblewoman, Rachel da Costa, widow of the incredibly wealthy banker, Abraham Swasso, who famously lent 2 million guilders to William of Orange to support his invasion of England in 1688, a loan which was repaid. So this is a very well-to-do family. And Crescas, you can see, calls Rachel Eshet Chayil, a woman of valor, for whom gold and silver are like dust. And you can see that he prints, even if you can't read Hebrew, you can see he prints their names in very, very large type. It's in fact the same size type as is used on the title page of the book itself. So this, I think, indicates the magnitude of their financial support. As he traveled, he also obtained rabbinic endorsements. These are called haskamot, which Crescas printed also at the beginning of the book. And these were central to early modern Jewish publishing, and they're still used today in some places. And they serve as a publicity blurb for the book, and they also guarantee a copyright for it. This is just one example. This is the Haskama from Yechezkel Katzenellenbogen, the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Hamburg. And he describes how glad he is that the work of Duran is finally being printed. And he decrees, as you see at the bottom, that no one can reprint the contents in any form for 15 years. So that guarantees protection for Crescas. So what can we learn from Crescas's travels? His introduction lavishes praise on well-known rabbinic scholars like Isaac Neto in London, Raphael Meldola in Bayonne, David Israel Atias in Amsterdam. But he also thanks the wealthy nobles, court Jews, and merchants who supported him financially and who hosted him as he traveled, like members of the Suasso family in The Hague, the Mendes da Costa family in London, the Curiel family in Amsterdam, and the Ergas and Franco families in Livorno. Book production served as a node of connection between distinct segments of Jewish society, forming a relationship between what we might call rabbinic networks, intellectual networks, and commercial networks, and it allows us to see these connections with new clarity. For example, Kreskas thanks a certain Yehuda Urbino in Amsterdam, writing that the scepter shall not depart from Yehuda, who has done this honor for the Torah. For him we sing a psalm of thanksgiving. Blessed is the one who does this. And our incredible archive scholar Ton identified this supporter as Judah or Leon Durbino, a merchant of Italian origin who dealt in diamonds and pearls, who became a tax-paying member of the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam in 1709 and died in 1745. You see his testament there. But what's so interesting to me is that in addition to supporting Kreskas, he appears as a patron in a very different context, which is that a few years earlier in 1714, the publisher Estienne Roger had dedicated to him an anthology of concertos by Martino Bitti, Giuseppe Torelli, and Antonio Vivaldi. So we can now connect these three very different records of the same person in different contexts to get a fuller picture of the complex overlapping circles of affiliation in this community. And in fact, I was delighted and very pleasantly surprised to share this material with some scholars of Vivaldi who have apparently been puzzled for decades as to who this Leon Durbino was. So we have inadvertently solved a very minor, admittedly, a very minor Vivaldian mystery. And actually there's actually will be a short publication in the forthcoming issue of Studi Vivaldiani, which is not a journal that I ever appeared, that I ever imagined I would appear in, but that's where. So Kreskas's journey traces an orbit of Sephardic communities from Algiers and Tunis to Livorno and Florence, Bordeaux and Bayonne, Amsterdam, and even as far as Hamburg and London, who all saw themselves as belonging to some shared affiliation. For example, the Portuguese-Italian scholar Rafael Meldola, not the Rafael Meldola that some of you might know from London, but his grandfather, Rafael ben Eliezer Meldola, was serving as the rabbi of Bayonne when Kreskas passed through in 1737 in the spring. And he himself, Meldola, was originally from Livorno, and he had just had his own book, Mayim Rabim, published, printed that very year in Amsterdam, edited by his son, David Meldola, who would go on to work on Sefer HaTashbetz with Kreskas. So it's possible that perhaps someone in Livorno, where Kreskas first landed, suggested that Kreskas stop in Bayonne on his way to Amsterdam and seek out Rafael Meldola for advice about printing houses. This, of course, is just my speculation. I have no evidence to support this, but mapping out this movement helps trace out the spider webs of familial and communal ties that shaped Kreskas's journey and which led him from place to place. If you look at the map, you can see that Bayonne is way out of the way if you're trying to go from Italy to Amsterdam. You don't need to go all the way to Western France. But the fact that he sought out those Sephardi communities in Western France that would support him suggests to me that he was that he had some sense of where to go. At the same time, I should say that these communities did not live in isolation, of course, but had vibrant commercial, intellectual, and material relations with their Jewish and even non-Jewish neighbors, as we'll see even more so in a moment. But before I get into the actual printing, I want to just mention that for those of you who are interested, I have prepared a full annotated translation of Kreskas's introduction, where he lists all of the places where he goes and all of the people that he stays with. it is published as an appendix to my dissertation, but it will not be published with the forthcoming article in Studia Rosenthaliana, and it will not be published when my dissertation becomes a book. So if you are interested in seeing it, please put your contact information in the chat, and I will be very happy to send you a copy if you're interested in, who Crescas stayed with in Bordeaux in 1738 or something like that. So that's the first half. That's Crescas getting to Amsterdam. Once he's in Amsterdam, though, what happens? And that's the new place, the new manuscript that we're going to look at. So he arrives in Amsterdam, and then he has to find a way to transform this manuscript into a printed book. And the first step is finding a press to work with. By the early 18th century, Amsterdam had become one of the world's most vibrant centers for Hebrew printing, as many of you may know. It had flourished in Amsterdam already for almost a full century, bringing together Jewish readers, authors, and press workers with a variety of backgrounds. Just in the 1720s alone, just as before Crescas arrived in Amsterdam, there are some 13 documented Jewish presses active in the city. Shortly after arriving in Amsterdam in the summer of 1737, Crescas picked one of them and entered into a business agreement with the printing house of, as I said, Naphtali Herz-Levi Rofe, or Hartog Alexander von Emden. Now, we don't know exactly what that contract was. We have not yet found any evidence of Rofe's agreement with Crescas, but again, thanks to Ton, we have found another agreement to print a Hebrew book in the Amsterdam City Archives between this same publisher, Rofe, and a woman named Sarah Brandau, or Brandon, widow of Isaac d'Azevedo. And the contract is written, as you see, in Dutch in 1726. It's witnessed by a Dutch notary. It estimates that the book's length will be about 1,000 pages. It stipulates that Rofe will receive 18 guilders for every page printed. It names the corrector, and we'll hear more about the corrector in a moment. In this case, the corrector was the Chazan of the Portuguese synagogue, Samuel Rodrigues Mendes. And it specifies that the initial run of the book, the initial number of the first edition, will be around 3,000 copies. So that's one example of archival information. We have another source on Rofe's press, which is a set of letters between Rofe and another scholar, a Provençal scholar named Avraham Montel, or Monteau, who printed an edition of the Mahzor of Carpentras with Rofe in 1739, just after he had finished printing our book, Sefer HaTashbetz. And these letters indicate that Montel had agreed to pay Rofe half of the expenses in advance, another quarter when the printing was halfway completed, and the final quarter of the expenses when the printing had been finished. So that kind of staggered schedule was probably similar to Rofe's work with Crescas. And sometime in the fall of 1737, the work began. Now, what did that look like? So let's take a look at this 18th century image of a printing house. Unfortunately, it's not a Jewish house, but as far as I know, we have no illustrations of Jewish printing houses from this period. If you know of one, please let me know. I have not seen an illustration of a Jewish printing house from this period. And in any case, the working process was essentially the same, no matter what language they were printing in. So this is probably close to what Rofe's printing house in Amsterdam looked like, if perhaps a little larger. We know from another one of Rofe's publications that he had 3 typesetters and 3 pressmen working on his staff at the time. So this is more or less what we have here. So I'm going to run through the steps of printing before we get into specifically Sefer HaTashbetz, which will be a review for some of you who are scholars of book history, but hopefully it'll get us roughly on the same page. So the first step, which you see at far left here, is typesetting, which begins with what's called casting off, estimating how many pages the printed book would be and how much text will go on each page. Then the compositors go through a copy of the book, that's called the printer's copy, and actually set the text in hand, letter by letter, of course, backwards. Once the text for a page was set, the type was locked into a frame, which is called a form, F-O-R-M-E, which you see at the bottom. and ready for its first impression. So it was handed to the pressman, who inked them by rubbing them with ink, or technically speaking, beating them with those ink balls, which are leather stuffed with wool. And it's important to get exactly the right amount of ink on them. Too much ink and the letters will bleed together, not enough ink and the letters will be too faint to read. So this demands a great deal of skill. And once the forms were inked, a sheet of paper was slotted into the parts of the press that are hinged, that you see, they're called the tympan and the frisket. And that was folded over. The frisket that you see here has 8 little rectangular openings. So that tells us that in this illustration, each sheet of paper would be printed with 8 pages of text on each side and then folded and cut, which means they're printing a book in the size called octavo, which is roughly the size of an average modern hardcover book, about 6 by 9 inches usually. If a book was printed with only 4 leaves per sheet, rather than 8, that's called a quarto. And books with only 2 leaves per sheet, meaning they put the whole sheet in, they printed 2 pages on it and then folded it just once without cutting, is called a folio book. That, for example, some of you might know Shakespeare's first folio. It was printed in folio, these are generally large luxury books. And this is how Sefer HaTashbetz was printed. It was printed in folio. So the paper goes in, the frisket is folded, the bed was slid under the press. It was then, of course, pressed. That's the most important part. This is called pulling. You pull the press down. This type of press that's operated by hand, called a screw press or a hand press, was used for about 350 years, basically from the time of Gutenberg until the early 19th century, when it was replaced with steam-powered presses. Although, of course, some people continue to use screw presses, and today there are letterpress printers who still use screw presses today, of course. After the pulling, the printed sheet was then taken off the press bed and handed to the corrector. The corrector checked the printed page letter by letter against the manuscript copy. This was an essential step in the process to weed out the many typographic errors, what we call typos, introduced during the typesetting process. Backwards letters, missing words, dropped lines, etc., etc. Most presses ran each page through to be checked and corrected 3 times, or at least they claimed that they ran them through 3 times to be corrected before signing off on the print run. And the correctors, who were often scholars themselves, also served as what we might today call editors. They didn't just correct typographic mistakes, but they also added titles, prepared indices, tightened and clarified the prose, corrected mistakes in the grammar, and even adapted or added content themselves. Finally, the corrected forms could go back to the pressman for the full run, and then the finished pages were hung up to dry before being gathered, arranged in the right order, folded into quires, and sent off to be sold. So this is the whole process of how a printed book came into being in this period. And this could take somewhere from a few months all the way to more than a year. And in the case of Sefer HaTashbetz, we can actually see this process happening, which is, as I said, incredibly rare in the context of Jewish presses. Printers' copies in general rarely survive, since they were not needed after the printing was completed. They were usually destroyed. And so even in the context of non-Jewish books, finding sources that reconstruct the working process of a particular printing house is tremendously exciting. For Jewish printing houses, it's almost unknown. There are only a handful of archival documents, like the ones that we saw earlier, that survived from early modern Jewish presses. And before my dissertation, I don't believe, although again, I'm happy to be corrected, I don't believe that anyone had identified a Hebrew manuscript that had been annotated as a printer's copy in an early modern Jewish printing house. So I was studying Sefer HaTashbetz because I was interested in books that moved from North Africa to being printed in Europe. And I came across an article written in the 1980s by an Israeli couple who had published an extensive bibliographic study on Sefer HaTashbetz. And in a footnote, they listed a number of manuscripts that were the right age and type to possibly have served as the source for the first edition. And I wondered if I could prove that any of them were actually the printer's copy. So I went trawling through the manuscripts microfilmed at the National Library of Israel, and I came across this one. Excuse me one moment. Which is an Algerian manuscript of Sefer HaTashbetz from the 17th century. And I noticed that there was that line of handwriting at the bottom of the page. And I said to myself, that's funny. It doesn't look like Algerian handwriting at all. It doesn't have any features of Sephardi script. It looks just like Ashkenazi handwriting. And as I looked at it, I thought, I think it's actually in Yiddish. And that led me to understand that this manuscript was in fact the copy that Kreskas brought to the printing house of Naftali Herz Levi Rofé in Amsterdam in 1737. It took me several months to track down exactly where the manuscript was. It had been sold at auction several times. It had changed hands. Finally, I located it. It's now at the Beinecke Library at Yale University. Now, it's not particularly glamorous. It's missing the first 16 leaves of text. The edges of many of its pages, as you see, are quite dirty. It's easy to understand why it has been overlooked. When it was sold in 1999 at Christie's, they describe it in the auction catalog simply as follows, and I quote, "Almost identical to the first printed edition with occasional marginal notes and scribbles," end quote. That's the direct from the catalog. So here are some of those scribbles, which are in fact some of the only known archival records of early modern Jewish press work. So here's this one that we see from the microfilm. Here's what it looks like actually in the manuscript. So you can see it is in Yiddish. It's written with a thick lead pencil and reads, "I must something probably set this page again." This, I imagine that this note and the half a dozen or so other notes like it written in the same handwriting were written by one of the typesetters or compositors. And we actually know the names of the two typesetters for Sefer HaTeshbetz because they signed their colophon at the end of the printed edition. So their names were Shmuel Zanvil, son of Yosef Schwab Ginsberg, and Zvi Hirsch, son of Yitzchak Siegel. And their names, as you might hear, testify to their Ashkenazi origins. And we already knew from other research that Ashkenazim were the majority of typesetters and pressmen in Jewish printing houses in Amsterdam, both for presses owned by Sephardim and Ashkenazim. So it's not surprising that Yiddish seems to have been the spoken language among the general workforce in Rofé's press. So that's one type of note. A second type of note was left by a different worker, also in Yiddish, in a different and maybe, shall we say, more refined handwriting. And I believe this is the hand of the corrector. Now, there are two correctors associated with Sefer HaTeshbetz. The first, the original corrector was, as I mentioned, David Meldola, the son of the Rabbi Raphael Meldola. He mentions in 1737 in another book that he was working on Sefer HaTeshbetz, but apparently he left the project pretty early and was replaced with a Dutch Ashkenazi scholar named Menachem Man Amelander, who was himself also a Yiddish author. I believe that this note is left by Amelander himself. We know a little bit about the work of the corrector from the preface that David Meldola wrote for another book that he corrected for Rofé's press. And he leaves a really vivid description of the working environment of the corrector. He writes, I'm going to quote here, "Many times the text was all ordered and fixed for the time of printing, but because the room was crowded and the workers would bump into each other, the letters would jump out from their place and shift from line to line and from form to form, but the workers would not pay attention to return them to their proper location." And David's brother, Moshe Meldola, was actually also a corrector, and he worked at a press in Livorno, which was owned by a third brother of theirs, Abraham Meldola. It was a family with another family with inky fingers. He left a similar description of his work, emphasizing that he had to go over the text and check each word 3 times. But even so, he knew that it was impossible that mistakes would not remain because of the running of the hurried workers saying quickly, "Speed up," who do not leave any room to correct calmly and thoughtfully. Sometimes I would fix a mistake and give it to the workers to print again, but they would skip over it from absent-mindedness. And aside from this, letters would stick out from the frame, but were not returned to their place, as is well known to those expert in the labor of printing. So scholars of early modern European printing have reconstructed the environment of the printing house as a workplace which was noisy, crowded, fast-paced, perhaps even frenetic, and it seems that Jewish printing houses were no exception. Printing was demanding work, which relied on speed, flexibility, and above all, cooperation between these workers of different backgrounds. A multicultural environment that brought together Maghrebi Jews like Kreskas, Western Sephardim like Meldola, and Ashkenazim like Rofeh and Amelander. Our manuscript, in fact, demonstrates that there was at least one other person participating in the printing process, and someone who left notes, this time only in Hebrew, in a Sephardi handwriting. And I believe that this is the hand of Kreskas himself. Thanks to Ton and Michael Wass, I was able to see a sample of David Meldola's handwriting, and it is not the same. So I feel confident that this is not the hand of Meldola, the corrector, but in fact the hand of Kreskas himself. He makes a number of corrections to the text, changing words, deleting scribal errors, but he's also added what appear to be instructions for the printers. It's not clear whether these were addressed to Amelander to read or the typesetters, or perhaps they were memory aids for Kreskas, who would deliver his instructions orally. But in any case, what they tell us is that Kreskas participated in the working details of the printing house, getting his hands dirty with ink, crowding over the page with the pressmen and the correctors to actually decide the format and layout of the final book. And we have one more piece of evidence that supports this, which is another note left by Amelander. And this one is in Hebrew. And it reads, "Thus the sage Reb Meir instructed me, if this does not fill up a complete page, I should leave the last page until he returns from Frankfurt, and then he will start the second section." So here again, Meir obviously is Meir Kreskas. The I presume, is the corrector, Amelander. And so these notes and the inky fingerprints on the pages around them illustrate how Kreskas, Amelander, Yosef Schwab, and Tzvi Hirsch, Shmuel Zanvil and Tzvi Hirsch, worked together in the printing house regarding the layout and typesetting and formatting of this book as part of a cross-cultural, multilingual, collaborative oral process. Finally, after some 2 years of labor, Sefer HaTeshbetz was finished. Many of the copies were given a beautiful luxury binding, as you see here. This particular binding survives in a number of copies, which are still prized by rare book collectors and libraries to this day. This book, as I've tried to demonstrate, is a unique glimpse into the world of 18th century Hebrew printing. His journey, Kreskas's journey, and the book's journey from North Africa to Northern Europe transformed a singular relic, an original manuscript, into a mass product, a book dependent on donations and subscriptions, the support of readers and noble patrons from throughout the Jewish world. The remarkable preservation of the manuscript, now Beinecke Supplemental 105, allows us to see, at least in this one case, the many hands at work in the production of this Hebrew book and the conversations that connected the people involved with it across class, nationality, and language. Just to conclude with a few final notes. Kreskas's original manuscript presumably stayed in Europe after the printing was finished. It eventually passed into the ownership of the German-born Rabbi Solomon Herschel, who served as the great chief rabbi of Great Britain from 1802 to 1842. After his death, it moved from his collection into the library of the London Beth Din, held by Jews College London, where it was microfilmed in the 1950s. That was the microfilm that you saw earlier. The manuscript itself remained there until the breaking up and sale of that library, as I mentioned, in 1999, making its way to the Beinecke. But what of Kreskas himself? He claims in his introduction that when he was in Florence, he asked the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Gian Gastone de' Medici, to be allowed, quote, to print the book and return to my homeland. But did he ever return to the Maghreb? He had a family there. In the introduction, he mentions his three sons, Tzemach, Yaakov, and David, whom he left back in Algiers, although no mention of his wife. But no evidence has yet been found of his return. It seems he stayed in Europe for at least some years, distributing the book to subscribers and selling it. As a handwritten note that I found in one copy indicates that Kreskas gave this one copy of Sefer HaTashbetz to a bookseller in the town of Neuwied in Western Germany in 1749, about a decade after the printing was finished. And the portrait that you see here was also painted around 1750 or so in Germany by the court painter Friedrich Wilhelm Goethe. In his portrait, Kreskas gazes calmly at the viewer, a faint smile on his lips, wisps of gray hair escaping his red turban. He holds a quill in his right hand, an open notebook in his left. Behind him, a curtain is drawn aside to reveal a shelf of books. I like to imagine that one of them is Sefer HaTashbetz, the book which Kreskas devoted so much of his life to bringing into the world and which remains today as his foremost legacy. Thank you all so much for your attention. I am, as I said, thrilled to be sharing this work with you through the Sephardic World community. I would be very happy to answer your questions at this time. I'll just stop.
Thank you. That was absolutely brilliant. It's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. Can I just use my privilege and ask a question? And it's probably you wouldn't know the answer. But within the workshop, what language do they speak to each other? If some are Portuguese speakers and some are Yiddish speakers.
Yes, it's an excellent question, and that I don't know. In the manuscript, so I presume that Kreskas was probably a native speaker of Arabic.
Yes.
He probably also spoke either Spanish or Italian, not fluently, but at some level. Meldula, of course, spoke Portuguese, Italian, and Rofe and Shmuel Zanvil and the others spoke Yiddish. It seems to me from the only notes that I have in the manuscript are Hebrew notes between Kreskas and Amelander, and Yiddish notes between Amelander and the typesetters, and among the typesetters themselves. So I think what that tells me is that there are sort of two levels. There's a Hebrew level, and sort of where the more intellectual scholarship is happening between Amelander and Kreskas. They probably could communicate, at least in writing, amongst themselves in Hebrew. And then there's conversation happening in Yiddish among the workforce between the typesetters and the, so like, did the typesetters ever speak to Kreskas? I have no idea. But what I can say is at least they were in the same room. Like they're all working in the same room together. And presumably they found some way to communicate with each other. Kreskas spent many years in Europe. What language did he speak when he was in Italy? What language did he speak when he was in Hamburg? I do know that there also is one document. I have not a passport, but a kind of an official identification document that Kreskas, it seems, took with him from Algiers, which is in French, which says, Meir Kreskas is, from Algiers. He's from a Sephardi family. He's originally from Barcelona. He's going to Europe to print a book. Please let him pass through your borders. And he has a letter in Hebrew from the rabbis of Algiers, the rabbinic court of Algiers, and that is sort of his entry into Jewish communities. And then he has this French document, which is kind of like a safe transit document for European authorities, which it seems like was in French. So there's a lot of movement across borders and across languages here. It's a really, really interesting.
A question for me: who did pay for his travels?
Would who pay for his travels?
For Kreskas.
Who paid for his travels? So I think it's a good question. I think initially his travels were paid for by some of his supporters in North Africa. He has one very wealthy rabbi in Algiers who supports him, named Moshe Tzaror, and another very wealthy noble in Tunis who supports him, named Avraham Nataf. Mm-hmm. So I think they gave him the money, at least for his first trip into Italy. There is one letter that survives in Italian from 1737 between two Italian rabbis. I think one is Malachi Cohen, and I don't remember who the other one is. No, Bassan. It's Isaiah Bassan. and he's writing a letter to another rabbi, and he says, oh, and by the way, this Algerian guy Kreskas is in town. He's trying to raise money for printing this book, Sefer HaTeshbetz. He needs 3,000 florins, and he only has 1,500 florins. So I don't know how he's going to print it. So it seems like by that point in Italy, Kreskas sort of ran out of money and didn't have enough money to work with an Italian press. And my guess is someone said to him, if you go north, there are more Sephardi Jews who might be willing to support this book. And that's when he went maybe to Bayonne, to Amsterdam, and then he found Rofé and was able to.
Did you follow his footsteps everywhere? Did you go to Amsterdam?
I wish. No, I wish. I would very much like to retrace the trip. It sounds like a beautiful trip on foot across from Italy to France, and then on a boat he specifies that he took a boat from Bayonne to Amsterdam, arrives in the port of Amsterdam. That would be a wonderful journey. Okay, let me look and see some of the questions here. Gosh, there are a lot of questions there.
There was a question about how long does it take to print the Sefer Torah?
Okay, so in terms of the timing of the printing, it's a great question. In general, I would say a large book like this, which could be a Chumash of the Torah, it could be a book of responsa. On average, I would say takes about a year to print. We know that Sefer HaTeshbetz, the printing was begun in the fall of 1737, but unfortunately in the winter, in January 1738, there was a terrible fire, and actually Rofé's printing press burnt down completely. Rofé says that he lost everything in his press. He lost the machines, he lost all of his paper, he lost all of his stock, and he had to start from scratch. And so they resumed printing, it seems like from the beginning, in the spring of 1738. And then the printing was finished in the spring of 1739. So from start to finish, it was really almost exactly a year worth of printing. What is important to say is that presumably Rofé, like almost all printers, was not printing one book at a time. They would probably have one large project that they were printing, like the Tashbetz or a Torah or a Chumash, and then at the same time they would be printing smaller, faster books, booklets, posters, broadsides, any kinds of more ephemeral printing that they could be done quickly. That would provide the capital. Again, economically speaking, the bread and butter of a printing workshop is in this period mostly in ephemera and short booklets and pamphlets. You can print those quickly, you can make a lot of copies, you sell them, they get out, people buy them, they're popular, and that provides the cushion on which you can spend a year printing a large luxury book in folio that may or may not sell a lot of copies. So
okay. Next question is, what motivated you to conduct this research, and how long did it take you?
Oh, thank you. I think so as I said, I was interested in general in studying the place of books and bookmaking in Jewish society in North Africa. I am by training academically a historian of North African Jews. So I was interested in books in North Africa. And I wanted to understand how North African Jews worked with books, and I learned, I could see that they had many printed books. They produced many printed books, even though they didn't have any printing presses. So it became clear to me that I needed to understand what the process was like for a North African Jew to travel to Europe to produce a printed book. And I was looking for a really good case study. So I was looking for a book where we had a lot of information about the person who printed it and the where it was printed. And for some reason, I don't actually remember how I came across Sefer HaTeshbetz. somehow I came across Sefer Tashbetz, and it has this very long introduction where he lists all the places that he stopped. So I thought this makes a really good case study. But then I became obsessed, you might say, with trying to track down the manuscript, because I was sure that it had survived. And I was inspired by the work of Anthony Grafton, if any of you are book historians, who has done a lot of work with non-Jewish printing houses and printers' copies and notes between typesetters and things like that. And I was actually taking a seminar with Professor Grafton at the time in Israel, and I was in the day, and then in the afternoon, I would go to the microfilm room and feverishly scroll through microfilms, looking for fingerprints, anything. And then finally, I found this note on the manuscript, and I as soon as I saw it, I said, I know, this is it, I got it. Then I had to find the manuscript. That took a long time. I have to give a shout out to Sharon Mintz from the Jewish Theological Seminary, who really, without her, I would not have been able to track down the manuscript. Because what happened, it was that when it was sold in 1999, its provenance somehow became detached, so that it was sold like from an auction house to a private dealer, and then from a private dealer back to an auction house. And when it was sold back to the auction house, it wasn't recorded that it had previously been in the London Bethlehem collection. So, this is one of the problems, in my personal opinion, one of the problems with the world of private dealers and collectors who don't keep track of provenance, is that it becomes very easy to lose track of these things and where they are. And so when the Beinecke purchased this manuscript from a private dealer who had purchased it from an auction house, who had purchased it from a private dealer, who had purchased it from an auction house, the Beinecke was not aware of the provenance of this manuscript. They didn't know that it came from the London Bethlehem collection. So when I spoke to the curator at the Beinecke and I said, do you know where this manuscript comes from? He said, I have no idea. In fact, I would be very grateful if you tell me. And I said, well, here's, I can give you a provenance, back to the 18th century. And he was thrilled. So we're very, very, just as my plea to anybody who's listening, who is involved in collecting things, please, please, please keep track of provenance. It's very, very important.
Nice. How many copies were printed of the book?
I don't know exactly. I imagine, again, thanks to the contract that Ton found, I imagine it was probably a few thousand. That seems to be a kind of a standard medium-sized printing run for a book of this size. I don't actually know how many copies are still survive. I've personally seen probably about a dozen copies, maybe 10 copies in person. And I own one copy myself. I'm privileged to own one
lucky.
Copy of the original printing. But I don't know.
If someone finds a copy for you, what should they look for? The provenance, as you mentioned?
Yes, so for example, as I showed you, there's one copy that was now in the Potsdam University Library, which has a note on the inside cover, which says, I was given this book by Meir Kreskas himself in 1749. That is, I can't tell you what an incredibly important piece of information that is, because it allows me to now say with certainty that Kreskas had stayed in Europe after the printing for at least a decade. I only came across that because the University of Potsdam happens to have digitized this particular copy, and I happened to come across it on the internet. So again, everybody who is looking and who's collecting rare books should look not just at the content of the books, but also are there stamps, are there inscriptions, are there marks of ownership. I would urge all of you to become familiar with the very, very important digital project called Footprints, Mapping Jewish Books Through Time and Space. It's run by a team of researchers in the United States. It's a phenomenal project that does exactly this kind of work, mapping out how books traveled across communities. So definitely.
You mentioned Sarah Brandau. I missed her relation to this project, or it was in this notarial deed.
Yeah, so she it seems like she was working with Rofe, the same printer that Prescott was working with, to bring a different book to press. It had initially been financed by her uncle, but he died in the middle of the printing. So I think he died in 1725, and this contract is from 1726. So it seems to me that she stepped in to take over the project.
How many women printers were there? All over.
Yeah, it's a good question. There certainly were women involved in the process. Certainly women who were, like, even Crescas mentions not just Rachel da Costa, but actually several women who financed the book or who hosted him when he was traveling. So they were definitely involved in that way. There were women who even brought some books to press. Sarah Brando is one. I came across another example in Livorno. There's another Sephardi woman who brings a book to press in Livorno in the 1770s, I want to say 1780s. And of course, there were a few examples of women printers, women who actually ran printing workshops. The two most famous examples are at either end of the time frame. There's a very famous woman named Estelina Conat, who ran a printing press in the 15th century in Mantua. And then there's Devora Rom, who managed the famous Rom printing house in Vilna in the 19th century. So from the 15th to the 19th century, those are sort of the bookends of women in printing. But Crescas, seems to have worked with a lot of women who hosted him, but he doesn't mention, it's so surprising to me, but he doesn't mention his own wife. Like his own wife doesn't even make an appearance. But there is one, I did find another example of another Algerian scholar who prints a book in Germany. And in the introduction to that book, at the very end, this is like 1770 or so, he does say at the end, "My thanks are due to my good wife, Hazibuena, by whose consent I traveled abroad. The success of this printing lies in her hands." I thought it was a really remarkable dedication and actually unique that I found.
Yeah.
Okay, a few other questions maybe if I have time. Someone asks why he's running out of money in Italy, is why he did not use a printer in Livorno. Can you tell us when printing began in Gerba? Two questions. So first of all, he actually couldn't use a printer in Livorno because there were no Hebrew presses in Livorno at the time. He was just a few years too early. Hebrew printing, there was a press in Livorno in the 17th century, but then it closed. And when Crescas was in Livorno, there were actually no Hebrew presses operating in the city. It did the first Hebrew press in Livorno in the 18th century opened in 1750. Maybe 10 or 15 years after Crescas was there. So he was just a little bit too early to take advantage. Of course, in the second half of the 18th century, Livorno becomes a major center, even overtaking Amsterdam as one of the major centers for Hebrew printing. But when Crescas was there, he could not take advantage of that. Printing did not begin in Gerba, like in the rest of North Africa, until the very end of the 19th century. Actually, in Gerba, I don't think there was a press until the early 20th century. I want to say 1910 or 1911. So the first Hebrew presses in North Africa were opened in Algiers in 1850s, in Tunis in the 1870s, and in northern Morocco in the 1890s. And then it was only really in the first half of the 20th century that it really emerged.
Slightly off topic then, but where did people in North Africa get their prayer books if they weren't going to?
Right. So in terms of printed books, well, it depends when. In the early part of the 18th century, the majority of printed books that were circulating in North Africa were from either from Amsterdam or from the major Italian printing centers like Rome or Venice, or from the Ottoman Empire. There were printing houses in Salonika, in Izmir, in Cairo. But of course, they had books in manuscript. You could just copy a prayer book in manuscript. But starting in the second half of the 18th century, Livorno really becomes the, overwhelming center for North African printing, and well into the 19th century and even into the 20th century. Like if you, as part of my forthcoming book that I'm working on, I'm adding a chapter about libraries. So if you do like an inventory of an early 19th century North African library, probably 75% of the printed books are printed in Livorno. It really had the lion's share of the market. Someone asked if any of the contracts between Crescas and the supporters exist. There actually is one. There is an Italian letter, which is now in the private collection of Dan Yardeni, which has a list of we, the undersigned, pledge to support the printing of Sefer HaTashbetz by Meir Crescas, and we commit to paying three Livornese petse per copy, and we're going to buy X number of copies of the book when it is finished, and then there's signatures for all of the people. So, and there's a blank form that was sent. One rabbi sends another form, I think from Venice to Modena, or from Modena to Venice, saying, Rabbi Crescas is in town. He's asking for subscribers. Please have your, local, members of the synagogue fill out this form and return it. And they send it off by mail. So yeah, we do have some sense of those kinds of contracts. And I think that actually is, if you look for, I think Dan Yardeni actually put up an online version of that on his academia.edu page. Are there any participants from London? Yes, he has a number of subscribers that he mentions in London, the Rabbi Isaac Nito, and then a number of members of the Da Costa family and the Mendez Da Costa family and the Pereira family. So again, in the appendix, which I've mentioned, I've tried to identify as many specific individuals as I can. Of course, as all of you intrepid genealogists know, that's not always easy, especially when he's writing in Hebrew. So he gives people their Hebrew names, which often was not the name that people went by. So, he says, I have to thank, Shmuel, Avraham, whatever, and that person actually went by like Alvarez, Alexander, whatever. So, you have to try and connect the dots here and figure all that out. But I've managed to identify almost everyone. What's really interesting to me is that I think he names about 150 individuals. Out of those 150 individuals, I would say, I think the numbers break down to about 100 of them are Sephardim, and about 30 of them or 40 of them are Italians, and then only 15 or 20 of them are Ashkenazim. So you can see, even though he's traveling quite broadly and even throughout Northern Europe, his networks of support are very deeply embedded in the Sephardi communities and in the network of Sephardi communities that he's traveling through. You can see, just in terms of the numbers, you can see quite clearly, even though he gets a few haskamot from Ashkenazi rabbis, and he does get support from a few Ashkenazim, and of course he works with an Ashkenazi printer. The majority, really the lion's share of his supporters belong to Sephardi diaspora communities, either in Western Europe, in the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, or in Italy. So it tells us something really about the kinds of communities he is.
Shall we do 2 more questions?
Before that, can I just jump in? Sorry, just use my privilege to jump in with a question. And Tom, this may be actually a question for you, but Was there censorship by the Amsterdam city government on what was published? That's to say, may there be some kind of correspondence tucked away there? Because presumably they wouldn't want Catholic books published in their city.
Not by the government, not before printing.
Okay.
After a book was printed, they might jump in and forbid the book and that's all.
Yeah, my sense is that, in fact, it was the reputation that Amsterdam had for a sort of intellectual openness and diversity of political, ideological, religious positions that made it a very attractive center for publishing, not just for Jews, but for many people came from across Europe to print books in Amsterdam. It was both the quality of their presses. They were renowned for their typefaces and for their printing expertise, but also I think they had a reputation for a diversity of books.
I came across a curious case of self-censorship. When the Torah was published, Torahs couldn't be sold in Poland, Germany, elsewhere, if certain passages were not kept out of it. So Amsterdam printers complied with this. And I saw a contract, I don't remember the name, but there was someone who wanted to print the whole Talmud.
Wow.
And for the European market, in cooperation with an editor from Frankfurt. And in the contract, it is said that they complied to all the rules that were there in different countries for not printing certain passages in the Talmud.
Wow.
And not only that, but they expressed a certain pride in the fact that they kept more passages out that might be offensive to Christians than anyone else.
Wow. That's
very curious.
Yeah.
So the printing business was a business to make money with, of course.
Of course.
And I don't know if there were any Talmuds printed in the 17th or 18th century that were not censored. Would you know that, Noam?
There are two excellent books about the history of printing the Talmud. I think they're both actually called Printing the Talmud. One is by Marvin Heller, and the other is an exhibition. It's a catalog from an exhibition that was done at Yeshiva University, which is also called Printing the Talmud. Yes, the Talmud, the Talmud, is one of the examples of the books that people have concerns about its contents. This, Sefer Tashbetz is really not a book that anybody is reading particularly closely for any examples of its content, other than the rabbis who want to reference it. People often ask me like the book, like what is the book about? What does it say? And I have to confess that it's not particularly interesting to me. It's a collection of late medieval legal responsa from a Sephardi rabbi. It's interesting to people who are interested in such things, but it's not a thrilling read. Let me say that. But I would be happy maybe to show people, since I happen to have my copy right here, and then perhaps we will close things up. So the last question, someone says, what is my next book? It's a great question. So I am hoping to convert my dissertation into a book which will be focused on Jewish bookmaking in North Africa. So it will include both a study of manuscript culture in North Africa and also Hebrew printing as it emerged in North Africa in the 19th century. And also, as I mentioned, some research that I'm doing right now about libraries and what kinds of books people owned and how many and where they were from and things like that. So hopefully that will be coming out, I don't know when, sometime. And then the other project that I'm working on is a very interesting, in my opinion, a very interesting book, which was published in Livorno in the 19th century, that was written by a Sephardi rabbinic emissary, a shadar or a shaliach. And someone actually asked a question about shadarim. So these rabbinic emissaries who were mostly from the Ottoman Empire, who would travel across North Africa, across Europe, raising money for Jewish communities in the land of Israel. So one of them publishes a very interesting book after he travels through North Africa. And he travels through Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria in the 1870s, just after, this is a very time of a lot of social upheaval for the Jews of Algeria, especially. They've been under French colonial occupation for a few decades. They were just granted French citizenship by the Crémieux Decree in 1870. And they're wrestling with all of these questions about modernity, about secularization, about national identity, about assimilation. And so this rabbi, whose name is Eliyahu Bechor Chazan, and he actually later becomes the chief rabbi of Alexandria, publishes this little booklet, really, in the form of a play. It's like a dialogue. It's like a dramatic play, and there are different characters, each representing a kind of person. So there's like there are female characters, interestingly. There's like a noble. There's a student. There's like a soldier. There's a Talmudish, there's an Ashkenazi, there's an Italian, and they have this debate about what does it mean to be a Jew in the modern world. It's a very, very interesting book. Nobody has studied it. And I think it tells us a lot about Sephardi articulations and understandings of modernity in this time of upheaval in the mid 19th century. I think it's a really unique window into how that's happening in North Africa and Ottoman context. So I'm hoping to write maybe an article, maybe an annotated translation, maybe we'll see how it goes. But that's what I'm working on at the moment. So let me just show you. So I have this is a copy of Sefer HaTashbetz. It is the first edition, but it is not in a contemporary binding. It's in a later, probably 19th century binding, which is unfortunate. And the binding is detached, which is also unfortunate. So you can see, just as another example, the very first page has an ownership inscription. Wait, can you see? Here. Which tells us that it was actually owned by a Polish, a Jewish, young Polish Jewish scholar. So it made its way into Eastern Europe. And it has also a Polish censorship stamp here from the 19th century. So this again helps us track how the book is moving eastward from Amsterdam, probably into Germany, and then from Germany into the Russian Empire. And so here you can see beautiful typesetting. You see this is how large, it's a large book in folio. This is a folio printing, beautiful paper. I mean, this is still, this is now what, 350 years old, and it's still doing very well. What is amazing to me about this book is, having spent so much time with the process of having it made, when I'm holding this book, it's like a handshake that I'm holding the hands of the people who made it 350 years ago, people that I know their names, I've seen their fingerprints, I've seen their sort of inky smudges on the pages. I know the typesetters, the pressmen, the correctors, and of course Meir Kreskas himself. It's an amazing and I'm very blessed to have the opportunity to feel personally connected to the history of making books in this way, I'll conclude by saying my own great-grandfather was actually himself a pressman, not in Amsterdam, first in Eastern Europe and then in Canada. But he worked his whole life making books as well with his hands. And so my grandmother used to say when she would find me reading a book, which was usually how she found me, to be honest, she would say, she would sort of laugh, and she would say, well, you know, in our family, we have inky veins. We have ink and not blood in our veins. So I feel very much connected in how the ink has flowed through the veins of my family and through so many families to connect us to the past. So thank you all so much for joining me. It's been a wonderful time. Do you, David or Ton, do you want to say anything about the Sephardic World Network?
Yeah.
What people can...
Well, I mean, first of all, Chazaku Baruch, it was really outstandingly.
Yeah, it was impressive.
Sorry, Tom.
No, it's, David. It was impressive. Thank you very much. It's and the reactions in the chat are also enthusiastic. Yes, before we say goodbye, I would like to thank our patrons who are supporting us and whose support is very important to us to be able to continue this work. I'm sorry to say that we do not have a speaker yet for the next week. We might have someone, but he or she hasn't confirmed yet. So keep an eye on our announcements, and we will see you next week. And over to David to round off the evening.
Oh, thank you very much. I will try to unmute everybody. And no, really, that was, before I unmute, that was very, very, very good. Thank you. It was absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
Really my pleasure.
Yes, and ours.
Hello, David. Hello, Ton. Thank you, Noam.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Hi there.
Thank you, Noam.
Thank you.
Really appreciate
Thank
it.
you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Is that
Brilliant.
whenever we're singing, we're going back to this middle note. For those who are musical among you, and this is a useful sentence. It's the tonic of our scale. It's the root of our scale.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Noam, for all your hard work and years of perseverance of doing your research.
Okay. Okay, goodbye.